Say, will somebody please pass the ketchup?
This is a tasty burger.
I'll take a Vornese burger and a side of Jason fingers.
Don't skip on the meat. I got a real good eye for prime meat.
Welcome to Hamburgers and Horror, the home of meat and monsters. I'm Noah Hook, and today I'll be ranking all 5 Hannibal Lecter films. Over the past few months, I've reviewed Manhunter, The Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal, Red Dragon, and Hannibal Rising, and it's time to decide which film comes out on top. The Lecter franchise is a pretty consistent group, with even the worst films being pretty enjoyable. Almost all of them have complex characters, fantastic performances, and a commanding use of sound and cinematography. The series has had a revolving cast of characters, but the one that has kept audiences coming back for 36 years is Hannibal Lecter. He had somewhat humble beginnings in Manhunter before becoming an unmistakable icon in the 1990s, which led to more sequels, TV series, and a ton of spoofs and parodies. He is present in all 5 films, and today I'm going to discuss which films do him justice. There is obviously a ton that goes into my ranking criteria, but to break it down quickly, I'll be looking for these key characteristics. First is the ambition of the movie, how much the writers, directors, and producers put into the script, plot, and general originality of the film. Second is the production quality, including things like the acting, cinematography, music, and set design. Third is the quality of the special and visual effects, especially in relation to the kills and cannibalism. Fourth is the quality and continuation of Lecter and the series, meaning how well the movie creates and continues Lecter's purpose and timeline, as well as how well it fits in with the rest of the franchise. And finally, how scary and/or entertaining the final product actually is. I won't specifically go into every category in detail, but they are a part of my judgment. I recommend checking out my full reviews of these films first so you can hear my more fleshed out thoughts. Here I'll mostly just be talking about a few key things that I took away from them. And before I jump in, I better give the usual horror YouTuber preamble. While I'm trying to look at these films objectively, it's impossible for personal preference to not impact the list. These are just my opinions, and it's okay if you disagree. I'm always curious to hear other people's opinions, so please share your rankings of this franchise with me down in the comments. Alright, I think I've covered all my bases, let's get to the rankings. Number 5. The worst of the bunch somewhat obviously goes to Hannibal Rising. I won't really beat around the bush with this one. Hannibal Rising is sadly a lower quality in almost every category than its predecessors. The acting is good, but not as good as the others. The cinematography is good, but not as good as the others. There is nothing about Rising that raises any of the previously set bars. But what truly secures it in last place is its script. The story is way too bombastic and over the top to match the Hannibal Lecter we know and love. Gaspard Ulliel does a good job with what he is given to work with, but he is the only memorable presence in the film. They tried really hard to fit this character and story into what Hannibal would become with a few throwaway lines or quick scenes, but it mostly just feels like a different character. As a revenge flick, it is pretty enjoyable, and even as a Hannibal film it isn't awful, it just tried to provide answers for questions that nobody was asking. The only aspect that really stands out is the on-screen violence. It is the most brutal film in the franchise. But the kills themselves are all pretty generic, none of them really stay with you after the fact. And that probably has to do with the paper-thin villains that make Lecter seem like an anti-hero of sorts. It is an unnecessary movie with unnecessary details, and it adds a lot of new components that don't really make sense with the chronologically later installments. If you don't think about it too much, Rising can be an adequate prequel, but the more you think about it, the more ridiculous the story gets. In a lot of horror franchises, Rising would at least be middle of the pack, but it just has the bad luck of following up an incredibly strong franchise. Number 4. My 4th favorite Lecter film is undeniably ambitious, but I sadly don't think most of the risks that Hannibal takes pay off. This is such a weird movie, and not in the usual way where the audience is titillated or engrossed in what they're seeing on the screen, more so in the way where the audience says, really, that's what they went with? It injects a lot of dark humor into the mix, and it has a collection of oddities including man-eating pigs, a very unnecessary first half in Italy, an excessively sexist secondary antagonist, and the man who connects all of these bizarre components together, Mr. Mason Verger. As usual, the performances are fantastic, and Gary Oldman makes Verger about as compelling as the character possibly could be. Julianne Moore does a solid job as Clarice, and it is primarily the script itself that loses the feeling of the character rather than her performance. From the very start, all we want is Clarice and Hannibal to reunite, and it just takes way too long to get these two in a room together. Not to mention that this film takes all of our hopeful ambitions for Clarice after The Silence of the Lambs and crushes them like fine dust. This is also the film that really hammers in that Hannibal is obsessed with Clarice and that he kills based on politeness. He still has a lot of Lecter intricacies, and Anthony Hopkins gives a fun performance, but this is the beginning of his condensing into a few key characteristics. All in all, Hannibal is still an enjoyable film. It just has a lot of strange tonal shifts and character motivations that deviate from the complex characters that were developed in The Silence of the Lambs. The unique elements of the story do provide an interesting viewing, but Hannibal is not a film I think I'll revisit very soon. Number 3. For me, there is a big jump in quality between my number 4 and my number 3 pick, and my number 3 and my number 2 are essentially tied. They earned their positions by the narrowest of margins, but for me, the bronze medal is going to Manhunter. This film is the most unique on the list, and the aspects that work really work. The cinematography makes the rest of these films feel downright bland in comparison, and this iteration of Will Graham is in my top 3 characters of the whole franchise. William Peterson perfectly captures Graham's deteriorating psyche, and he makes you believe the difference between him and the Lecters and Dollarhides of the world is very thin. There are a couple of aspects that kept it from going higher on my list though. It is an incredibly procedural film, and while I occasionally appreciate a realistic look at the investigative process, I rarely find myself wanting to revisit these kinds of films. Manhunter is also excessively 80s. That isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the movie feels very dated, and certain components like the musical inclusions feel really out of place to me. I also want way more of Dollarhide, and the final act ultimately feels anticlimactic. But Manhunter is the first Lecter film, and while the later installments would deviate from it quite a bit, this is the one that paved the way. Brian Cox turns in a much more subtle performance as Lecter than how we'd see him later, but he still gives Hannibal a powerful, unnerving aura that you don't want to be alone in a room with. Michael Mann really took the project and made it his own. It plays with coloring, layering, reflection, and it really correlates the imagery on screen to the themes around identity. I completely understand if Manhunter is your number 1, but for me there are 2 films that narrowly edge it out. Number 2. The silver spot goes to the second adaptation of the previous story, which would be Red Dragon. I've been debating Manhunter and Red Dragon in my head ever since I reviewed both of them, but there are just a few things that leave me preferring this iteration. Both films have fantastic casts, but I prefer the characters that were given more screen time in Red Dragon. We spend way more time with Dollarhide and Reba, and I think that leaves the 2 characters feeling more realized. We get so much more insight into the Red Dragon's ideology as well, which makes Francis more sympathetic and more compelling as a villain. There is more emphasis on Lecter's relationship with Will as well, which helps to bolster Graham's compulsive character. He's less damaged than he is in Manhunter, but Edward Norton still turns in a strong performance as him. Anthony Hopkins feels a bit more like the classic Lecter we were hoping to get more of in Hannibal, but Ralph Fiennes really steals the show here. His performance as Francis impresses me more with every viewing. I admit that Red Dragon feels a bit sanitized or corporate compared to a lot of the weirder films on this list, but there's still enough bizarre scenes to keep audiences wondering what Dollarhide will do next. It also provides a way more exciting and a way more cathartic ending at the Graham house. It plays out the procedural scenes with less of that Michael Mann objectiveness, which ultimately leaves the movie having more emotion. All in all, I think Red Dragon is a very strong outing for Hannibal and company. It isn't the most artfully made Lecter film, but it has a tight script and is acted very well. Number 1. This probably comes as little surprise to a lot of people, but I find The Silence of the Lambs to be the strongest outing in this franchise. It's obviously the most well-known movie here. While a lot of people don't know anything about the others, everybody knows The Silence of the Lambs. But it isn't just notoriety that landed it at the top of my list. Clarice's struggles as a woman in the FBI is both subtle and overt, and these themes are explored through the dialogue, but also through elements like the cinematography. Jodie Foster gives an impactful performance, and her character is one of the few in this franchise that you genuinely want to root for. This is also Anthony Hopkins at his absolute best, and his performance as Lecter is both terrifying and captivating. They make him so menacing from behind a glass wall or iron bars, and it's just incredible how scary the idea of him getting out is. The whole film we watch him invisibly orchestrate his escape, and we see the difference between him and a killer like Jamie Gumb. Buffalo Bill's character hasn't aged the best, but Ted Levine's performance still brings genuine emotion and some absolutely unforgettable moments. These three characters thematically tie into each other's conflicts, and it creates a very cohesive story. It still has those investigative elements, but it doesn't get bogged down by all the procedural stuff, and while it provides a ton of motivations to its characters, it still leaves a lot to the imagination. I think it has the best ratio of Lecter behind bars and Lecter wreaking havoc in the world, and his discussions with Clarice are simply some of the best written moments in all of horror. There are so many reasons this film turned Hannibal Lecter into a household name, and that is why I put The Silence of the Lambs at the very top of this awesome franchise. And there you have it. Those are my current rankings for the Hannibal Lecter franchise. Do you agree with my list? Disagree? Please let me know down in the comments. Everyone I talk to has a slightly different list, so please share your thoughts with me. I'd love to discuss. I was pretty brief with my reasons and explanations, so please go watch my reviews if you haven't so already. Next week I'll be doing another ranking video, but on a much bigger scale. We'll be celebrating the 2-year anniversary of me starting Hamburgers Horror, so be sure to tune in. Well, that's about it. Thank you all for joining me, and an extra thank you to my patrons. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching my Hannibal Lecter movie rankings. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror reviews. And if you want to help support this channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks y'all.